So, thank you so much, Dorothy Kelly, for accepting our invitation to talk to us today in this NEOLAiA Mega Alliance meeting. And welcome to the NEOLAiA family.
Thank you very much indeed, Ida. A great pleasure to be here.
So, Dorothy is a professor of translation at the University of Granada in Spain, where she also served as the vice rector for internationalization for 15 years. She has been a member of Spain's national Bologna experts team and a member of the board of the Committee for Internationalization and Development at the Spanish Rectors Conference. She is a member of the advisory group on higher education to the Steering Committee for Education of the Council of Europe. And since 2018, she's been the coordinator of Arqus, which is one of the first 17 European University Alliances that was approved by the European Commission. And I will start by asking you some questions that have to do with the present and also the future of the European higher education area. So first of all, what major developments are currently reshaping the European higher education area? And also, which do you expect to involve in the upcoming decade?
To come to the European higher education area, I think the present and the future, I would actually start perhaps by looking back a little bit at the Bologna process and the European higher education area as being a major driver for transformation of the European university system, the European higher education system, with a huge amount of expectation, I believe, from some parts of the sector. Although I think that we very, very often concur that what did give rise to very good expectations for transformation has sort of got stuck halfway along. We very often say, there is not one Bologna process, there are 48 Bologna processes, depending on the number of signatories at the particular time. And there has been a sort of a nationalization or renationalization of the transformational potential of the Bologna process, I believe. So what would my hopes be for the future and what would the major developments be? I think, and if I can just link this to NEOLAiA and what brings us together here today, which is the European Universities Initiative, I think the European Universities Initiative has proven to be an excellent driver for the European higher education area to return to some of the basics and to return to many of the issues which have plagued the Bologna process since its inception, simply because of different ways of implementing the agreements reached at European level, at ministerial level. Some of the agreements simply have not been implemented in some countries, and others have been implemented in very diverse ways. And I think we can see a very, very good example here in joint degree programs, for example. So my hope for the next decade would be that through the European Universities Initiative, Bologna will resume some of its initial goals, will return to some of those, and will be revitalized for the future.
Thank you so much. That's very encouraging for us all listening to you now, as very engaged people in the NEOLAiA Alliance. You were talking a bit about the mobility issue. So how do you see student and staff mobility evolving, let's say, in the upcoming 10 years? And especially then thinking about some of the newer takes, such as blended mobility, and also how we can widen the participation and make mobility more inclusive.
Yes, well, those two elements that you've just mentioned, of course, Ida, are closely linked to each other because blended formats, virtual formats, will lead or should lead to wider inclusion in mobility. I think it's for quite some time now, since the 1990s, physical mobility as the basis for internationalization strategies has been called into question because it tends to be quite exclusive because it can never be for 100% of the student population. The famous Bologna target of 20% of graduates having had a significant international experience has not been reached. And even that target means that 80% of the population would not have had, or not necessarily have had an international experience. So I think there has been a clear move away from physical mobility as the basis for internationalization strategies, and I think that is positive. I think the pandemic, the silver lining of the pandemic is that we learned we could do a lot online. I am a great believer in physical mobility and total immersion in other cultures, but I do understand that this needs to be combined with virtual formats, with COIL formats, with shorter term mobility. So despite all the research into cultural competences and culture shock, which tend to point to longer mobility as being more impactful and also easier for a person to deal with, a lot of our students and staff can only do short-term mobility. So there will very definitely be an increase in short-term mobility. There will be an increase in virtual and blended formats, all of which should lead to wider inclusion. And I think the alliances have quite a role to play here in being innovative in the way in which they address mobility and understand mobility beyond the canon of the long-term, semester-long study mobility for students.
Great. So if we go past let's say, the traditional mobility, semester mobility, and also the shorter and the virtual mobilities to some of the maybe deeper collaborations that we see in transnational education at the moment. So this could be joint programs. I know you have a lot of experience also with the European degree label. We have, of course, as you mentioned, virtual mobility, but we also talk a lot about micro-credentials, making internationalization and education more accessible in other stages of life as well. How do you see that these types of collaborations will change the ways universities operate? So this could be on a national level, European, or even on a global scale.
My hope is that this kind of initiative will really change the way universities operate, and it will make our universities much more outward looking and much less inward looking than is sometimes the case today. This kind of deep transnational collaboration is very, very different to open student mobility. It's not the same for a single student to go and take programs at another university as for 2, 3, 4 universities, a whole alliance of universities to sit down together and say, together we can produce better programs. We are complementary in our strengths. We can do something that is truly better quality for our students, and actually establish deeper long-term agreements on working together, on truly working together, not simply sending and receiving students. So I believe that is very, very much a step in the right direction. Whether these programs be full undergraduate, postgraduate, doctoral programs leading to joint degrees, or whether they be short-term micro-credentials, summer schools, or various different academic activities. Beyond the actual activities themselves, I believe that this kind of collaboration also changes the way in which academics and teachers see their work, how they understand that working in isolation is much less rich and much less fulfilling for them, but also, of course, for our students. So I do believe that this kind of deep, much more embedded collaboration should have a truly transformational effect on our teaching and learning.
Thank you so much. I think that's very encouraging to hear from many who are here today, especially working with our joint programs, our Task 2.3, and so many other activities where we really do see this transformation that goes beyond simple exchange. So if we look more at the strategic dimensions for universities, so can you see any practical steps that alliances can take to embed the work that is done within the alliances into the individual partner universities' internationalization strategies, or even strategies on a wider scale?
I think actually, yes, from my perspective, it would be strategies on the wider scale, understanding that alliance activity, like internationalization activity, is very, very transversal to our institutions. And I think this is one of the first lessons from the entire European Universities initiative, is that this is it's not a short-term project, and it is not something that can be dealt with only in the international office, but rather it is a very, very transversal strategy to change, to transform our institutions for the better. We have identified very, very clearly in our alliance that there is a need for permanent interplay between the alliance level strategy and the institutional level strategy. So when we wrote our first alliance level strategy, we built, of course, on our universities' individual strategies and drew on the commonalities that we found amongst them. Then once we had the alliance strategy, there was feedback from the alliance strategy back to the institutional strategies. And we have seen over the years how the various university strategies of our different member universities have incorporated some of the ideas from the alliance strategy. And this permanent interplay, I think, is what is absolutely essential if we are truly to embed the work of the alliances into our universities, and if our alliances are truly to serve our individual university strategies.
Thank you so much. And what do you see as the main achievements and also maybe the main challenges of the European Universities Initiative so far?
I think the European Universities Initiative so far has been a success story. I think if we look at the recent history of higher education in Europe, we can identify perhaps three major moments, three major points of inflection as major drivers of transformation. I think the first major driver of transformation was the Erasmus program itself in 1987, which started as something very, very modest and has today become, I think, beyond a shadow of a doubt, the European Union's biggest success story for creating European identity, which is not a minor issue, given the current geopolitical situation we are facing. The second major driver would be the Bologna process. So when the Bologna Declaration was signed in 1999, I think perhaps with mixed success, I think there has been some success at structural level. I think there has perhaps been less success of the Bologna process at a more substantial level of transformation of our systems. And the European Universities Initiative, which again started off pretty modest, it was to be 6 alliances. I don't know if you remember that first call. 6 alliances who were to be funded following the famous speech by Emmanuel Macron at the Sorbonne. And today, in a very, very short period of time, we have 65 alliances involving 570 universities all the way across Europe, with a huge amount of activity, a huge amount of collaborative activity, which is producing change within our universities for our students, for our academic communities, and for our professional communities, but which is also producing, I think, change at national level. And I'm sure we'll come back to discussing the national level in a moment, and at European level, at policy level. Higher education is back on the agenda, and I think that is very good news for universities in general. And the model of deep collaboration is managing to involve universities who perhaps traditionally were less involved in the international field on the European level, in policy discussions. And can I also say that I think a major, major success of the whole initiative has been that it has produced a wave of cooperation, not just within our alliances, but across our alliances at European level. There is truly a huge community across the 570 universities involved in the alliances, working in the same direction and enthusiastic about the impact that we can have at various different levels. The challenges, however, of course, are huge. The ambition is huge. And I think we have to say that, of course, the structures, and in particular the funding structures, are not at the same level as the level of ambition. So one of the big challenges will inevitably be finding a sustainable, holistic, flexible, predictable funding model for the future. And then the other challenge, of course, will be constantly attempting to remove all of the barriers which we find across various different levels. We always talk about the national level as being the level which produces most barriers, but in actual fact, there are also barriers at the European level, and there are also barriers at our own institutions, obstacles that we build for ourselves that we also need to, and those will be the major challenges.
Thank you so much. I could not agree more with you, both when it comes to the achievements and the challenges. I think many of us here will be recognizing many of the things that you have said. Of course, we as alliances want also to have a positive impact on the regional, national, European, global level. What do you think we can do to achieve that impact? I know it's a big task, and as you said, the ambition is set very highly. So, if you have any recommendations?
Yeah, well, no magic wand, eh? There are no magic wands here. Can I say that in order to ensure impact, I think one of the most important things is intentionality. So I think that when we as alliances write our interminable project applications and reports and so on, instead of just looking at this as a project with tasks and deliverables and so on, we need to be thinking way beyond that. So I think to ensure impact, we need to be intentional about trying to reach that impact. So we need to look way beyond the outputs, way beyond the figures, to how are we really, really impacting on our students' experience, on our institutional experience, and on society, of course, because that is what, as universities, we are required to do. So rather than try to go into detail here, Ida, because I don't think there is time to go into a great deal of detail, I would insist a lot on intentionality, being very, very explicit about what we want to achieve, but not in terms of output.
So time does fly when you're having fun. So I will now just wrap up with a very last, very forward-looking question, and that is, how do you envision the role of the European Universities Initiative in 2035? So that's 10 years from now, and how might it redefine collaboration within the European higher education area?
It's a big question, Ida. And as you say, time flies, and it doesn't just fly when we're talking now. It has also flown since 2018. So the initiative is a very, very young initiative with huge ambition and huge expectations around it. And I think, as we said earlier, that it has been hugely successful in a very short period of time. The first funding was in 19 and we're only in 25, so only 6 years. And we're already seeing a big impact on the European system, on the culture, I believe. So I would hope that by 2035, that impact will have been even greater, that there will have been a culture change, a mindset change across the European higher education area, where, shall we say, that the collaborative mode becomes the default mode, where transnational cooperation becomes default in all of our institutional strategies. And here I think I should also underline that this impact should not only be for the universities in alliances, but that it is extremely important for us to understand that the transformation and the impact must be systemic, must go beyond only the universities in alliances, and really open up our entire system. And I do think, for the first time, perhaps since the beginning of the Erasmus program, which I really do see as a very initial starting point, a tendency towards the system opening up and towards this mainstreaming of transnational cooperation, which we in internationalization have been trying to push for so long. And sometimes you just need a little bit of an external push. And I think Macron's speech and the ensuing calls from the European Commission have certainly been that little push in the right direction to mainstream this collaborative approach.
Thank you so much for those very important and also inspiring closing words. I think this will give us a lot of energy for the continued discussions here today. And I also want to thank you on behalf of all of the NEOLAians out here so much for taking the time to share your thoughts, ideas, and all of your very substantial experience with us today. So thank you so much, Dorothy.
Thank you very much indeed, Ida. It's been a very great pleasure. And I really do wish you all the very, very best for your event and for the future, of course, of your alliance. Thank you.